Ladies and gentlemen, a very big warm welcome, please, to Mary Mellor.
I'm here to talk about, to start with, to talk about ecofeminism. My title, it's up there, well, yes, okay. Sustaining Life, Ecofeminism versus Economic Man. Now, when I think of the ecofeminist movement, I think of all things nature-y and all things woman-y and all things dance-y. And so this sort of slide sort of sums up the kind of joy and commitment that seems to come with this idea of this movement. I don't know if any of you are or anyone in the audience is familiar with ecofeminism or has been part of the ecofeminist movement. It emerged in the early 1970s. It was named by a French woman, Frances de Bonne. She said it in French, which I won't even try to do. But it emerged sort of in North America, in places like India. It seemed to bubble up about the same time in the 1970s as the ecology movement got going, and what's generally called second wave feminism got going in the 1970s as well, the kind of equal opportunities movement. So it all seemed to come in that early stage. There's no ecofeminist party. It hasn't sort of formed itself into a politics like that. It's a set of ideas and a set of philosophies that link women and nature. So let's have a think about how this is done. The link, ecofeminism, as the name would seem to clearly imply, links ecology or ecologism with feminism. And the debate really is about, well, what's the nature of that linkage? Why should women be particularly associated with nature or nature particularly associated with women? And this caused some consternation in the different movements, because obviously in the ecology movement, the men in the ecology movement would say, well, why are women saying they've got something special to say about nature? Why are they seemingly more in communication with nature than the men are, who are equally concerned about the environment? So the ecology movement has never really embraced feminism as such, or ecofeminism, because it's seen as not particularly the key element for. But what this has meant for the ecology movement and the green movement generally, and the environmental campaigns, is that they are gendered. That is, the leaders tend to be men in general, and the women tend to be at the grassroots, getting on with the community stuff. But also, feminists were a bit concerned about why women are getting associated with nature, because obviously women were left out and denied the vote because they were seen as being rather frivolous, rather silly, full of the vapours, driven by their wombs. And so a lot of women, a lot of feminists, didn't like the association of women being somehow closer to nature, because it fed to all the prejudices about women's position in society. So it's not been an easy association, the ecofeminist notion. It's not been easy, because, as I say, for those various reasons. And you can make a link between what you could call an ecofeminine position and an ecofeminist position. Ecofeminine is that women, in their bodies, in their embodiment, in their ability to give birth, in their ability to nurture. So in the feminineness of women is the association with nature, because nature nourishes, nature gives birth, nature nurtures. So the association is very much that women are in their embodiment are closer to nature than, say, men are. That's one case you can make. But the other side is that the more ecofeminist side of it is that it isn't that women are necessarily more natural than men are, but that women's position in society is structured and is marginalised and is prejudiced against in the same way that nature is marginalised in modern society. And that is the model that I take more closely. But I don't deny that there is a strong argument about birth giving and nurturing and flourishing. Now, one of the reasons it was thought to be a bit romantic connection was that a lot of the early founders of the movement tended to be poets and theologians. There was a lot of stuff about the goddess and the gods and goddesses, and a lot of poetic work. So one of them, an example, coming from 1978, "This Earth, What She Is to Me" by Susan Griffin. "This earth is my sister. I love her daily grace, her silent daring, and how loved I am. How we admire this strength in each other, all that we have lost, all that we have suffered, all that we know. We are stunned by this beauty, and I do not forget what she is to me and what I am to her." Now, that is very identity between women and nature. But then Susan Griffin is a poet. And that's what poets do. They put things in very particular terms. But there's lots of other aspects of ecofeminism. An early example, for instance, is the Kenya Greenbelt movement that stems from this era, led by this woman, Wangari Maathai, who just had the idea that there was the problem of deforestation, the problem of soil being blown away. So she came up with a bright idea. Why not just plant trees? And so a women's movement grew up in Kenya, and right across Africa, copied it, where women in their communities planted trees and then nourished them, watered them, looked after them, and millions of trees were done. Now, you could say, well, men could do that as well, men plant trees. But this was a women's movement of tree planting, and it was something women felt they could do, something local, something immediate that they could do. Another aspect that is usually associated very strongly with ecofeminism is tree hugging. This is particularly connected, although these are, you can't tell what nationality these huggers are, but one of the main movements around this era, again, was the Chipko movement in India, and there's a debate about it, whether it was a women's movement or whether it wasn't, it was a men and women together, so we'll leave to one side, but the image was of women hugging trees in order to save trees from deforestation. And people were arrested and all the rest of it, as you would be if you were making campaigns. But the Chipko movement gained universal awareness of it. And so tree hugging, put your own body in front of the tree. So that and this connected women from different parts of the world, women from America to India, to Australia, to all countries, to Kenya. So there's lots. So it wasn't a movement where people just sat and talked. It's a movement of activism. It's a movement of doing things. It's a movement of campaigning. Another aspect of it was the peace movement. This is where I came into touch. This is the Greenham Common campaigns of the 1980s. And this is where I came into touch with ecofeminism. It's the first time I saw the image of a goddess, bigger than life size, with offerings of apples and oranges at the foot. And I just was wandering through the bushes, as you do at Greenham Common, and I suddenly came across this image of the goddess. And the first early ecofeminist books were circulating, mainly written in America. And so that's and I was interested. This movement seemed to mean something to me, because the green and the feminist, but I would add a social commitment as well. So the peace movement was linked to women's involvement in the peace movement, particularly the Greenham Common. I don't know how many people knew of or remember Greenham Common, but the point is it started off as men and women but in the end it decided to become a women's peace camp because they felt that the soldiers would not be able to deal with women as well as they would pick on the men. Whereas if women were there, this would discommiserate the soldiers. They wouldn't know what to do, and they didn't know what to do, to be honest. These are all activism things, but the thing to remember as well is that women are, among the poor, the women are the poor of the poor in terms of disadvantage, and men are seriously disadvantaged, but wherever men are disadvantaged, women are more disadvantaged. And it's not just campaigning, hugging trees. It's the real life of real people who have to deal with the environmental degradation. And particularly the campaigns about desertification and that sort of thing, but also about toxic waste, because toxic waste were dumped. There's a big campaigns around toxic waste being dumped in poor communities, particularly in the American South. And it was women who had to deal with the byproducts of this, of ill health in the family, contaminated water. And so there are big campaigns about, in the communities, about toxic waste being dumped on poor communities. And particularly that's happened in Africa, where boatloads of rubbish is just taken in and just dumped. So these images then are important in ecofeminism. Women as mother and nurturer. Now, whether that makes women closer to nature than men or not, because men can be nurturers as well, but it's the image of ecofeminism is woman as a mother and nurturer. There's a lot of sort of religious spaces to ecofeminism as well, particularly from the theologians who were brought up and trained in what they called the male sky gods, the idea of that God is a man, and starting to argue very closely, well, why isn't God a woman? So either seeing God in general as feminine rather than masculine, or at least not particularly masculine, or setting up an alternative goddess. Some of the evidence for this is done by these figurines in anthropological, archaeological digs, where from prehistory, pre-writing, these figurines of nobody quite knows what they were, but they come from the earliest days of human civilizations, and it's particularly thought to be to do with fertility, and women being worshipped as, or the female image being worshipped as a symbol of fertility, because I suppose in a day where, in an era when people didn't live very easily, then fertility was very, very important. Another aspect was the idea that in early historical periods, societies weren't patriarchal, they weren't dominated by men, but were dominated by women, and there was a lot of studies, and matriarchal studies, that women were once venerated, hence the fertility images and the goddess image. But women were leaders, women were given privileged positions, and they were listened to, and their wisdom, they were venerated for their wisdom. Again, another example is that early human communities, and I dare say a lot of people in this room will be familiar with these ideas, that early communities were much more in tune with nature, particularly Native American societies were thought of being particularly benign and understanding and live well within nature. So we've got all these images coming together, which aren't exclusively ecofeminist, because obviously the green movement very much links itself to pre-industrial, non-industrial societies. But all these ideas come together of women, community, identity, sustainability, important networks. So what we end up with then is a sort of image of women caring for the world. Not to say men don't care for the world, but that women have a particular take on this. Women bring a particular attitude, a particular style, a particular experience that they can bring into caring for the world. And this would be the basis for ecofeminism. And this looks the loving, caring, harmonious piece of the world. I'm not sure the world is like that. So this is more my image of women caring for the world. And this is the ecofeminist image, I think. This is ecofeminine, loving woman caring for the world. This is ecofeminist, woman being put upon. And so this is more my starting point. Do women welcome being, are they altruistic in this sense? They're thinking and caring for others and sacrificing themselves for others and for the planet, for the better good? Or is it an imposed altruism? Is it something women feel they have to do because if they don't do it, who else will? So this is the position. So what I did was, when I started getting involved with ecofeminism, because it really appealed to me, and I loved all the poetic stuff, and I'm not particularly a religious person or a spiritual person, but I quite, the ideas of the goddess and things like that, they're sort of, it's romantically appealing, I thought. But then I thought, well, how true is all this? How true is the matriarchal societies that pre-industrial communities lived in more harmony with nature, and that everything was wrong with modern society and the earlier societies were somehow more pure and good? So I read all the anthropological literature I could get at. Now, there wasn't much on women, actually, because most of the anthropologists were men. So they like to know who's in power, who does what, who fights with who builds the biggest tent, who dominates. And it was very hard to find anything about the lives of women, particularly things like birth control, which was often through infanticide. And, it's very, a very dark side to dealing with harsh environmental conditions. But I did come across one example of somebody traveling in North America at the time, a preacher who wrote a sort of a Voyager diary. And this is what he said: a life of constant toil. We're in the 17th century here, 1600s. Canadian Huron women, and that's a Native American tribe, till the soil, sow the corn, fetch the wood, strip the hemp, spin it, make fishing nets, harvest the corn, attend to the house, follow their husbands from place to place, where they serve as mules to carry the baggage. And he goes on to remark that the men don't seem to do very much. And when I read, I looked at some stuff about sub-Saharan Africa and the Bushmen of the Kalahari, which is meant to be some of the people who live closest to very original people's way of life, and who supplies the most calories, men's hunting or women's gathering and trapping, because women trap animals, and found that by far the most calories were produced by women in their own agriculture and farming and trapping of small animals. Whereas if the men went out hunting, they tend to eat it before they got home. So even today, there's a tendency in the ecofeminist movement, people talking about the way I'm talking, to talk about women's position in society as a love economy. Unlike the market economy, there's another economy of caring and nurturing and sharing, and this is called a love economy. I think, again, that's romanticising. It is true that many people do, men and women, do things out of love. But there are other more harsh aspects to the economy. So as far as there is a love economy, I'm very happy with it. And I'm happy people carry on loving each other, caring for each other and nourishing each other. But I was worried about the rest of society, that what's going on there. So what I've come to think about is, rather than to specify and think actually, well, there is something in society that women do that they tend to do more of. And we all recognise this, that women tend to do more domestic work. Not in every case, but in large cases. And women don't get the same promotion at work, and they take more responsibility for the family, etc., etc. So I wanted to think more about this women's work and its relationship to nature and its relationship to the modern economies. Can we get out of the trap that we're in modern societies? Without doing it person by person. You can do it person by person. People make life choices. But is there any way we can look at social structures, economic structures, and see if we can change them? So I began to think about modern economies and in relation to women's work. And I became more aware that I began to develop this concept, economic man, who depends on not just the work of women, but the work of nature. That is, we're creating a model of economy which suits somebody which I call economic man. Now, economic man can be a woman. It's not that that means physical men. It's an image of an actor in society, the consumer, the taxpayer, the worker, the boss, and particularly the decision maker, etc. And this image of the man with the briefcase is very much representing economic man. But like I say, there are many women who live the life of economic man. And so the question becomes, well, where does women's work fit into that? This nourishing, this caring, this domestic work. And I came up with what I call the economic divide between what can be seen as economic man and what can be seen as women's work. Now, women's work isn't necessarily done just by women. Men do women's work. Children do women's work. Historically, slaves and servants have done women's work. But it's work that's less valued and sometimes not valued at all. And it's work that, and it's a style of society that doesn't fit with modern economies. So let's look at this divide. It's the difference between market value, the price on the market, the profitability, and the giving of the services themselves, which I call subsistence. That is the actual process of nourishing people, which I call provisioning. So it's much more important what gets done than how much it's worth on the market, how much profit is made out of it. So that sets up then the difference between personal wealth, how much do I have, how much can I own, how much have I got in the bank, with social wealth, which I define as social reciprocity. How much can you rely on other people? How much do we share? How much do we sustain each other? Economic man, the divide here, is concerned with able-bodied workers. It doesn't want anybody who's sick. It doesn't want anybody who's needy. It doesn't want the old, and it doesn't want the young. It wants machine-ready human beings, basically, who will do the jobs and not ask for any help. It's an economy that stresses labour, the importance of labour, and also intellect. Now, there's nothing wrong with labour and intellect. I mean, we don't want to do away with labour and intellect. But this leaves out the body. It's not just the labour somebody can do or their brain, it's how are they educated, how are they nourished, how will they be looked after when they're too old to work anymore. So it's responsibility. The women's work is responsibility of the body, because when somebody can't work, is too young, too old, too sick, too needy, they tend to be looked after by women. Not exclusively, but they tend to be looked after by women. Economic man's also interested in exploitable resources, whereas the divide puts on the other side, and this isn't exclusively cared for by women, but by non-market attitudes, the care for the ecosystem and for wild nature, nature that isn't tamed, that isn't exploitable, that can't be priced. Economic man favours knowledge and intellectual property rights, not knowledge when it can be bought and sold. Whereas the other side deals more with feelings, and a word that the ecofeminists are very fond of, the idea of wisdom, that comes from experience and thought. And of course, economic man is interested in unlimited growth, constant expansion for making profits, whereas the other side of the divide would be sufficiency, enough, which I'll come to some of those in a minute. Now, one of the well-known women in this field is Vandana Shiva, who's the chronicler, really, of the Chipko movement in India. And she travels the world giving marvellous talks. I mean, I can't lay a patch on Vandana. She moves mountains, quite literally. But she came up with it looking like this, with a German woman called Mary Mellor, and said, really, modern economies are like an iceberg. On the top, you've got waged labour, you've got capital, and you've got the public economy, which is paid for. You've got all the institutions of government, and you've got what we think of as the economy. And underneath it, you have all the hidden depths of, and they put in this list, home working in the informal sector and child labour, subsistence and peasants' work, women's housework, colonies, the exploitation of people's land and labour, who are seen as not important, as less important than the central heart of the economy. And at the bottom there is nature, that nature holds the place up. So what then is women's work? Women's work is basically, I've sometimes said it, being embodiment and embeddedness. It's body work. It's caring, nurturing, and emotional support. Now, this can be done in a formal economy for money, but it's largely done in an informal economy, in an unpaid way. It's also local. Women's work tends to be local. It's based, because it's based around the body, it's based around the home and the community, and therefore it's not your 24-hour across the globe whizzing around in jet planes. It's communal, it's close to home. It tends to be routine and repetitive, particularly across the globe, fetching and carrying, weeding, cooking and cleaning. The job that when it's done, you have to start again. But part of it is not just what you do that we need in what I call women's work. It's being available, it's being dependable, it's being there. And this kind of, all this stuff, this body work, this community work, this routine repetitive work, is mainly unpaid or underpaid. So it hangs out of the formal economy. So what we could look at really is women's work is cleaning up the world and dealing with the world, while economic man gets on and becomes a fat cat. It's the difference between the world of the fat cat and the world of everybody else. Now, the fat cat does have to look after herself a little bit, but they tend to rely on servants, PAs, legions of people that make their life possible. And you can carry that all the way down through. So to put this in a little bit more structured terms, how long have I got? Half time. That's where I wanted to be. Good. So let's think about this in a more structured way. This, as you can see, goes back to 2001, because trying to think of how do you put this into a conceptual way. And basically, the big thing we sit in is the ecosystem. We all sit in the ecosystem. And what I call economic man, which covers the public sector that's funded as well, is what I call the valued economy. This is the economy where money works, and which is judged in money terms. How much it costs, how much you're going to pay. But overlapping this, somewhat inside the system, so not completely separate, is women's work, some of which is paid or underpaid, care work. Then on the other side there's ecosystem damage, some of which is paid for. There are clean-up operations, there's decommissioning, but a lot of it goes unpaid for, unacknowledged. And then there's the whole world of the non-market economy, pre-market subsistence, where people mainly do their own work, people who've opted out of the market economy, but also the community, the world of the community, caring for each other. Now, what the technical phrase for particularly ecosystem damage in women's work is an externality. That is, it's something that the valued economy relies on, but doesn't want to pay for. So it externalizes the problem. It doesn't acknowledge it. It doesn't put it in the accounting system. And there have been lots of campaign, particularly led by, now her name's gone out of my head, Marilyn Waring, an Australian, who was an Australian MP. And she was so annoyed that the United Nations system of national accounts, when she again goes back to the late 1970s, so she's part of this early movement. She says, why isn't women's work counted in the United Nations system of national accounts? And why isn't nature's work? Why isn't the value of nature counted? And she led a massive campaign and wrote a book called If Women Counted. And she got it into the United Nations system of national accounts. She got an estimate of the unpaid women's labour, which actually comes out as more than the paid economy, if you add up all the hours that people do. It comes to a bigger number. And it tries to cost or put a value on nature. And there's a lot of work done, not just by women, I mean by ecologists generally, trying to get the value of labour, of nature put in. So, what's the solution then? I've set up the problem. I've set up where women are. What do we do? Now, there's a lot of talk about, well, let's abandon modern society. We've taken a wrong turn somewhere. We've got to come back. We've got to come back to some sort of pre-industrial sort of system. So do we get rid of the money economy then? Do we go back to, as many people in the room possibly are doing, to growing our own food, who looking after ourselves, building local communities, building local economies? Do we go back to a pre-market, pre-money society? I think that is there are societies that have not yet fully entered the market, so there's a lot of work done to preserve those societies and those economies that haven't yet gone into that system. And a lot of people are trying to move out of that system. Again, I've got no quarrel with that. But I don't think that's going to solve the problem of the big urban communities we've got, the massive 25 million people in Mexico City. I don't think it's going to solve that problem. So I think we have to think more radically about what we do in the current system than the idea we can all go back and own our own field and build our own house in the corner of our field. I just don't think that's possible. I think there's another danger which has turned up, where people have formed new ecological communities. And this is where the danger that we move from economic man to ecological man. I read quite a lot of male-written green literature, and it's all about getting out of the rat race, getting out of the job, and then you've got all the leisure you want in the world, you can do what you want, you can, everything's fine. And of course, who does the washing up? Who looks after the kids? Who takes the rubbish out? And the danger is, and particularly what I don't think is seen by these writers who think you go straight from the slave economy to leisure, they don't realize that if you're going to be serious about not using fossil fuels and not using too much energy, then all of women's work gets much harder. No vacuum cleaners, no washing machines, no hot water, no showers. Everything gets harder if you haven't got labor-saving devices, which of course are energy using. So in fact, in a sustainable, ecologically sustainable society, it may well be that the whole of life work, body work, just gets really, really hard. And I don't think this realistically, because and these are, to be honest, they are male writers, and I've taken them to task. I've said, you're assuming it's going to be a fairly, bucolic life. But as soon as you take all the energy-saving devices out, then body work just becomes really hard, physically keeping yourself going. Weeding, grinding, weaving. Women historically, women used to walk wherever they went. Women held a weaving stick in their hands because that was how long it took to turn wool into yarn. And they would be doing this constantly. And there's early pictures of women just walking along the road doing this because they're spinning as they're walking because it takes so long. So what can we do in modern economies to avoid these dangers? I think we've got to stop thinking about economy, because that means you start thinking about money, markets, profit. I think we've got to stop thinking in those terms and start thinking about provisioning. That is about not just what we now do as paid work, but what was done as unpaid work and the provisioning of nature. So I think what we've got to do is to integrate women's work with all the other work and decide where our priorities lie. And of course, for me, the priorities would lie in women's work first, which is all that list I had on one side of the thing, and making the economy much less important. And in fact, not important at all. And also, we can't if we're going to be sustainable, we can't have growth. So what we want to think about is sufficiency. There's been a lot of debate about basic needs. What basically do people need? And people have been saying, oh, you can't specify. Do they need a television? Do you need transport? But I think it's much more simple than that. It's to do with the concept of enough. It's not making a list of what you actually need. It's saying, who hasn't got enough in today's world, and who's got too much? And I think if you keep providing stuff for the people who haven't got enough and start taking away from the people who've got too much, then you'll end up in the middle when everybody has sufficient. Simple notion, but... and this takes me to money, because money is seen as the enemy here. This was the idea of the subsistence economy. Let's get rid of money. Now, the question we have to ask is, does money necessarily encourage greed and inequality? It would seem that money is the problem. Money is blamed for causing inequality. Instead of, I think, the other way around, inequality is to blame. and money is the representation of inequality. Because, and this comes with what's happened in our modern economies, the way we think of money. I think if you think of money, this is the image in your mind. You think of gold, coins, pieces of 8, piracy, exploitation of the new world. But that's modern, that's money in the European concept. But if you go to Micronesia, this is money. And people are quite happy. These are completely unmovable. Well, you can put a tree trunk through them and carry them with about 30 people. But the point is, nobody wants to possess them, have them in their safety deposit box or whatever. What the money is a useful way of measuring. So somebody owns a quarter of that stone. The stone never moves. And they sell something to somebody or give a gift to somebody, and they own slightly less of the stone, and somebody owns slightly more of the stone. Doesn't matter, the stone's still there. So it's not the money that it's not valuable in themselves. They're just big lumps of stone. In fact, the most valuable one lies at the bottom of the harbour, and nobody seems to mind that nobody will ever be able to get it up. But it's still useful for calculation, for relative values. And in fact, when it comes even to Europe, gold coins were not used mainly because there wasn't enough of it. They were too soft, and they were too valuable in the sense that one gold coin was about a month's labour. And you couldn't break it down to be useful in daily work. So what people used were these. Tally sticks, which are the precursors of the modern checkbook, where you'd decide how much your money was being transferred between whoever the two people are, and then you cut it down the middle, and one takes one half and one takes the other half. And in fact, taxes were paid in this. Now, there's nothing valuable about that. That's just wood. But it became valuable because people agreed. People agreed to honour the value on those bits of wood. So it's not the money that matters. It's not the fact that it's made of gold. It's made of wood or made of stone. It's the fact that we decide to honour it. So money isn't valuable in itself, and we know that even today. Look at all the ways you can have money. Yes, you can have coins, but they're not gold coins like this. It's mainly base metal. It's computer entries, it's cards, it's paper, it's checkbooks. All this is different kinds of money. There's no reason why this should be like gold. I've got all my gold. You say, I've got all my paper, or I've got all my stone, or I've got all my wood. So what we need to do is think more creatively about money. I haven't got time to go into it, but in my latest book, I go very much to the difference between public money and private money. That is, money created and circulated by the public sector, by states, and money created and circulated as debt by banks. I call my book Debt or Democracy. I don't have time to go into explaining the difference between these, but it is perfectly possible for public money to be created free of debt and spent. And very soon we'll see it happening, because the private economy has been on its knees now for a very long time. And we've seen quantitative easing, which is giving money to the banks. But some countries have got the sensible idea and says, well, why don't you give the money to the people? And in fact, the first person to do this was George W. Bush, of all people. He gave every taxpayer in America $1,800 when the crisis happened, when the crash happened. Hong Kong gave everybody, I think it was $6,000 Hong Kong dollars. Australia gave everybody some money. Just gave it to people because to keep the economy ticking over. So it's perfectly possible to have a circulation of money if necessary. You have to do it carefully, and you have to do it, as I've explained in the book. You've got to do it carefully, but there's nothing actually technically wrong with it. But most of you will be more familiar with social money. That is, we've people reclaiming money for themselves. I mean, here's the Bristol pound. People developing and circulating their own money. So this is where I tie up my ecofeminism with modern, more radical ecological thinking and social thinking. Because if you're starting to use social money, then you can decide what you're going to allocate your social money for. And you may decide that it's much more important to pay unpaid care workers, to give people who are doing domestic work, who are working in the home or working in the fields or working in the community or working in the voluntary work, to give them an allocation. There's nothing wrong with that. And so what we can do in a provisioning system is see money not as something that makes profit or is only done if it's valuable in itself, but to think of money not as gold and things that make people greedy, but think of a money system like the stones, like the wood, like paper, as tokens through which we can determine and allocate social provisioning. This comes from Canada, the Canadian Social Economy Hub. And many of you will be involved in this, I'm sure. You'll be involved in. But I don't know whether you've thought about it as much as clearly integrating previously unpaid work with what was previously paid work. That is integrating, spreading provisioning across the whole of society and not just the market. Otherwise, you're in danger of going away from global markets, but recreating a local market that still ignores all of women's work, that still ignores the needs of nature. The thing I like, I've nearly come to an end now, is that, got 10 minutes. Well, you'll be able to have some questions in a minute. What I really like is the idea of the babysitting circle, and this can explain why I think it is important to deal with money and to have a token system. If you've got a group of people who want to babysit for each other, and you don't usually have more than 10 or 15 people in the circle, you could do it all by personal interaction. You could phone somebody up and say, can you babysit for me Tuesday? And then I'll babysit for you Thursday. And I babysit for Sue and Peter last week. Now, if you babysit for them, then I'll owe you one. And you know, it's perfectly possible to do it on word of mouth and sorting it out. But isn't it easier that when somebody, and I don't know if any of you have been in babysitting circles, where somebody just cuts up a sheet of card and gives everybody 10 tokens priced at 1 hour. And basically, when you've done your babysit, the person you babysit for just gives you some of the tokens, which is a money system. But it's not a money system to make profit. It's not a money system based on debt. It's not a money system based on exploitation. It's just a convenience, an absolute convenience. And the money's free of charge. You get given your 10 tokens, and then you begin the process of providing the babysitting. It's much the simplest way to do it. And that's why I think we can have sustainable economies, provisioning economies, if we treat money as tokens, not using money to make money, but money just to enable us to interact with strangers without having to do everything in full detail. I'll make some sandwiches for you, and you do the gardening for me. It's much easier if you do it by tokens. So I think it's possible to democratize money. I think you can have a money system if we think of money as a token for social benefit, where we can do the things we need to do on a large scale, on megacities, where we can use money to provide sufficiency provisioning for us and for the social services we need and the care services we need and the market services we need. I think there is a space for market services. But I think we've let the market determine all our view of what money is, what labour is, what transactions are, what savings are. I think we've let the market run away with us, and we've got to reclaim the economy for the people. And I think ecofeminism provides us with a route in to be able to start thinking, rethinking what an economy could be. And there's some references. I also have some flyers which are there for the most recent book, which is Debt or Democracy, Public Money for Sustainability and Social Justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Mellor.